Elliot Evans leaned against the railing of the ferry, the salty ocean air cutting through his jacket as he watched the waves roll beneath him. He had built this ferry business from the ground up after purchasing it from an older couple 10 years ago. Back then, it had been a struggling operation with outdated boats and poor customer service. Over the years, Elliot had poured his time, energy, and money into revamping it, expanding to 6 ferries serving thousands of passengers daily. But lately, something felt off. Customer complaints had been stacking up: rude employees, dirty decks, and delays with no explanations. His district manager, Greg, insisted it was just the usual griping from impatient travelers, but Elliot wasn't buying it. He needed to see for himself. So he disguised himself. A graying beard, reading glasses, and a thick beanie covered most of his face. He wore an old windbreaker and scuffed sneakers to blend in. Since the company had grown, most of the newer employees had never met him in person. To them, he was just another passenger. As he made his way toward the seating area, he heard laughter, loud and mocking. "Did you see that old guy trying to climb the stairs?" a voice snickered. "Yeah, I thought he was gonna keel over right there," another voice added, barely holding back a laugh. Elliot's stomach twisted. He turned his head slightly and spotted 2 young ferry workers leaning against the railing, whispering and laughing as they watched an elderly man struggle to find a seat. The man looked exhausted, gripping the metal pole for support. Elliot froze. The workers, one with messy blonde hair, the other with a thin mustache, weren't lifting a finger to help. Instead, they kept snickering, nudging each other as if the old man was some kind of joke. Elliot clenched his jaw. He had built this company with the belief that customer service mattered, that people came first. Seeing his own employees act like this made his blood boil. He took a deep breath and approached the elderly man first. "Sir, do you need a hand?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The old man gave a grateful nod. "I'd appreciate that, son." Elliot helped him to a seat near the window, making sure he was comfortable before turning back to the 2 workers. They were still snickering, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. But Elliot wasn't going to blow his cover just yet. Instead, he decided to test them. He walked over casually. "Hey, I think that man needed a little help. Shouldn't you guys be assisting passengers?" The blonde one, whose name tag read Dylan, rolled his eyes. "Not our job, man. If he can't handle a ferry ride, maybe he shouldn't be on one." The other worker, who had Travis on his tag, shrugged. "Yeah, we're not babysitters." Elliot's fists tightened at his sides. He wanted to call them out right then and there, but he needed to see more. He had to know if this was just 2 bad apples or if there was a deeper problem. So he played along. "Guess that makes sense," he said, forcing a chuckle. "You guys been working here long?" Dylan smirked. "Long enough. Management doesn't care what we do as long as we show up. Half the time we just chill and no one notices." Travis nodded. "Yeah, as long as the boats don't sink, we're golden." Elliot felt sick. If these 2 felt this comfortable slacking off and mocking passengers, how many others were like them? He needed to dig deeper. For the rest of the ride, he observed everything. Workers ignoring passengers, a trash can overflowing near the snack stand, a spilled drink left unattended. There were a few employees actually working, a young woman wiping down tables, a deckhand securing the ropes properly, but the laziness and disrespect were overpowering. By the time the ferry docked, Elliot had seen enough. He had a serious problem on his hands. And soon every person responsible would know exactly who he was. Elliot stepped off the ferry with a weighted silence hanging over him, his mind replaying everything he had just witnessed. The careless behavior, the blatant disregard for passengers, the way those 2 workers had laughed at an elderly man struggling to find a seat, it all sat like a stone in his gut. He had spent years building this company, believing in the importance of customer service, and yet here he was, seeing the cracks firsthand. He needed to see more. Instead of heading back to his office, he walked toward the terminal, blending in with the crowd. He spotted a small coffee stand tucked in the corner, its counter lined with impatient customers waiting for their orders. A young woman in a company uniform stood behind the counter, her shoulders tense as she worked quickly. The man in front of Elliot sighed loudly, shaking his head as he checked his watch. "They never have enough people working this stand anymore," he muttered to no one in particular. "Used to be 3 workers here. Now it's just her." Elliot frowned, watching as the barista, a girl who looked barely out of high school, struggled to keep up. She moved efficiently, but it was clear she was overwhelmed. He noticed the sweat forming at her temple as she hurriedly poured a coffee, nearly spilling it in the process. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward and gave her a reassuring nod. "Take your time," he said, keeping his voice calm. She barely looked up as she rang up his order. "Sorry for the wait," she mumbled. "It's just me this morning. We're supposed to have 2 people, but my coworker called out. And no one covers shifts anymore." Elliot took his coffee, watching as she turned to the next customer. Another red flag. If employees were constantly being left to handle things alone, that meant management wasn't stepping in. He had hired Greg, his district manager, to make sure things like this didn't happen. Yet here was another example of neglect. He took a slow sip of his coffee, scanning the terminal. Across the room, near the boarding area, a uniformed worker leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. His name tag read Eric. Elliot watched as an older woman with a rolling suitcase hesitated near the entrance, looking around uncertainly. She approached Eric, asking him something, but he barely glanced up from his screen, nodding lazily before returning to whatever he was doing. The woman seemed confused, standing there for a moment before turning away, clearly unsure of where to go. Elliot's grip on his coffee cup tightened. That was it. He walked straight toward Eric, stopping right in front of him. The worker didn't even look up. Elliot stood there for a second, waiting, but the man continued scrolling. Finally, Elliot cleared his throat. "You work here?" Eric sighed, lowering his phone just enough to glance at him. "Yeah. What do you need?" Elliot gestured toward the terminal entrance. "That woman just asked for help and you barely looked at her." Eric shrugged. "I told her where to go. You barely spoke 2 words to her." Another shrug. "Not my fault if people don't listen." Elliot exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. He could feel his patience wearing thin, but he wasn't ready to reveal who he was just yet. He needed to keep gathering information. Before walking away, he made a mental note: customer service was failing badly. Employees weren't just being lazy, they were disengaged, indifferent, and completely uninvested in their jobs. And that was a leadership problem. Elliot headed toward the maintenance dock where the ferries were serviced between trips. He wanted to see if the same issues existed behind the scenes. As he approached, he noticed a group of workers sitting on overturned crates, chatting. A few of them had cigarettes in their hands, the smoke drifting lazily into the air. One of the men, a burly guy with a deep voice, was in the middle of a story, laughing. "I swear, I don't even check half the stuff on those maintenance reports anymore. If the boat's still floating, it's probably fine." Elliot stopped in his tracks. Another worker, a younger guy, chuckled. "Yeah, unless it sinks. Then we'll have to pretend we did all the checks." Laughter erupted from the group. Elliot's stomach turned. He kept walking, pretending not to hear, but inside, fury burned. If these workers weren't taking maintenance seriously, that wasn't just a customer service issue, that was a safety risk. He had seen enough. It was time to confront the truth. Elliot had seen enough. His company was rotting from the inside, and it wasn't a small problem, it was everywhere. Employees who didn't care, management that wasn't stepping in, and now, the worst of it, maintenance workers openly admitting they weren't doing their jobs properly. It wasn't just about bad customer service anymore. This was about safety. If something went wrong on one of these ferries because of negligence, people could get hurt. His jaw was tight as he walked back toward the main terminal. He wasn't going to waste another second watching. It was time to confront the reality of what his company had become. He pulled out his phone and dialed Greg, his district manager. The call rang several times before a sluggish voice answered. "Yeah?" Elliot kept his tone controlled. "Where are you?" A pause, then a lazy response. Handling some paperwork at the office." Elliot had already checked Greg's car wasn't in the lot. "Which office?" Another pause. Then Greg exhaled. "All right, I stepped out for lunch." "What's going on?" Elliot's patience had reached its limit. "Meet me at the terminal." "Now." Greg hesitated. "Can this wait?" Now." Elliot hung up before Greg could argue. He wasn't going to let excuses drag this out. By the time Greg arrived, Elliot had positioned himself near the employee break area, watching as workers milled about, some actually doing their jobs, others barely pretending to. When Greg finally showed up, he looked irritated, his shirt wrinkled, a coffee cup in one hand. Elliot didn't waste time. He dropped the disguise, pulling off the beanie and glasses. The moment Greg recognized him, his entire posture shifted. His eyes widened and his grip on the coffee tightened. "Elliot?" Elliot's voice was sharp. "Walk with me." Greg fell into step beside him, his expression shifting from shock to forced casualness. "Didn't know you were visiting today." "That's the problem, Greg. You should never need a warning." Greg let out a nervous chuckle. "Look, if something's wrong, I can handle it." Elliot stopped walking and turned to face him fully. You don't even know what's wrong yet. Greg hesitated. All right, what's the issue? Elliot's tone didn't waver. I just spent the morning undercover. I saw employees mocking passengers. I watched a worker ignore a customer right in front of me. I stood near a group of maintenance guys laughing about skipping safety checks. You tell me, Greg, how did it get this bad? Greg's face paled slightly, but he tried to recover. You know how it is. We're short-staffed, people get overwhelmed, and sometimes they slack off. It's not ideal, but... No, Elliot cut in. This isn't just slacking off. This is negligence. This is a complete failure of leadership. And you're supposed to be running this operation. Greg shifted uncomfortably. I can tighten things up. If we need to discipline. Elliot's stare didn't waver. Where were you supposed to be today? Greg hesitated. Like I said, handling paperwork. You weren't here. That's the point. Elliot's voice was steady, but each word hit with weight. You're supposed to be making sure this business runs the way it should. Instead, I found employees doing whatever they wanted because they knew no one was watching. Greg exhaled, looking around as if hoping for an escape. You're fired. The words landed like a hammer. Greg's mouth opened, then shut. He blinked, stunned. Wait, hold on. You can't be serious. Elliot didn't budge. I trusted you to run this, to enforce the standards we built this company on. And instead, I walk in to find the worst customer service I've ever seen. Employees who think their job is a joke, and a complete disregard for safety. This isn't just about you being absent today. This is about the culture you allowed to fester because you weren't doing your job. Greg's shock morphed into frustration. You can't just fire me over one bad day. This wasn't one bad day. Elliot's voice hardened. You think I haven't been paying attention? The complaints have been piling up. I gave you time to fix it and you didn't. I had to see it for myself to realize just how deep the problem runs. Greg looked around again, his confidence cracking. Look, I can turn this around. No, you can't. Because if you could, you already would have. Elliot's tone left no room for argument. Turn in your keys. You're done. Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. But he knew there was no talking his way out of this. He pulled his keyring from his pocket, yanked off the company key, and slapped it into Elliot's palm. This is a mistake, Greg muttered. Elliot met his gaze. The mistake was letting this go on for as long as it did. Greg turned and walked off without another word. Elliot took a steadying breath. Firing Greg was necessary, but it wasn't the solution, it was just the start. He wasn't going to stop there. He turned back toward the terminal, scanning the employees. Some were doing their jobs well, but others, the ones who had gotten too comfortable cutting corners, those were the ones he needed to deal with next. He had let this business slip too far from his hands. That was over now. Elliot didn't waste any time. With Greg gone, the next step was addressing the employees who had been contributing to the toxic culture festering on the ferries. He walked back through the terminal, his posture rigid with purpose. His presence was no longer concealed, and the moment workers noticed him, the energy in the room shifted. Some stiffened, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Others exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly aware that the owner of the company was walking among them. He didn't stop to acknowledge the nervous whispers. There was work to do. The first place he headed was the maintenance dock, where he had overheard the careless remarks about skipping safety checks. He spotted the same group of workers from earlier, but this time they weren't lounging on crates. They were standing near a tool cart, talking in hushed voices. The moment Elliot approached, their conversation died. One of them, a stocky man in a grease-stained uniform, cleared his throat. Mr. Evans, he said, straightening his back. Didn't know you were coming by today. Elliot's eyes moved over the group, his expression unreadable. I'm sure you didn't. A younger worker shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. No one spoke. Elliot let the silence stretch before finally breaking it. I'm going to make one thing very clear. Safety is not optional. I overheard comments this morning that made me question whether my own employees take their jobs seriously. Laughing about skipping maintenance checks? Joking about whether a ferry will sink? That's not just irresponsible, it's dangerous. The stocky man swallowed hard. We were just messing around. We do the checks. Elliot's gaze didn't waver. If that were true, you wouldn't be joking about it. A taller worker, likely in his late 20s, exhaled sharply. Look, we're stretched thin. Ever since staff cuts last year, we've been handling double the workload. We're exhausted, and yeah, sometimes we vent in ways that don't sound great. But we're not reckless. Elliot considered this. He had authorized budget cuts to increase profitability, but he hadn't realized the extent of the strain it had put on the maintenance crew. That didn't excuse careless attitudes, but it explained why corners were being cut. "You should have brought this up to management," Elliot said. "Instead, I had to hear about it by going undercover on my own ferries." The stocky man hesitated. "Greg didn't exactly listen when we did." Elliot's jaw tightened. Greg had been a problem in more ways than one. "He's no longer with the company." That piece of information sent a ripple through the group. The younger worker's eyebrows lifted slightly, while the tall one exhaled through his nose. Elliot continued. "Things are changing. Starting today, I'm bringing in additional workers to relieve some of the pressure. But I need to be clear. If I ever hear anyone joking about skipping safety checks again, they won't work here another day." "Understood." The stocky man nodded immediately. "Understood." Elliot gave them one last sharp look before turning on his heel and walking away. One issue addressed, now onto the next. He made his way back to the terminal, heading straight for the employees who had openly disregarded passengers. Travis and Dylan, the two workers he had caught mocking an elderly man, were leaning against the counter near the boarding area, chatting like they had nothing to worry about. The moment Dylan spotted Elliot walking toward them, his posture stiffened. Travis, slower to catch on, kept talking until Dylan subtly nudged him. When he turned and saw Elliot, the color drained from his face. Elliot stopped directly in front of them. "You too. My office." Now. Neither dared to argue. They followed him silently through the terminal, the weight of the moment sinking in. Once inside his office, Elliot shut the door and turned to face them. "I want you to explain something to me," he said, his voice measured. "What made you think it was acceptable to mock a paying customer on my ferry?" Dylan lowered his head slightly, but Travis cleared his throat. "We didn't think anyone heard." "That's your excuse?" Elliot cut in, his tone sharp. "That no one heard?" Travis hesitated, realizing his mistake. Elliot continued. "Let me tell you what I heard. I heard two employees laughing at an elderly man struggling to find a seat. I heard the same employees brag about how little effort they put into their jobs. And I saw those same employees ignore passengers who needed assistance. That's the kind of behavior that destroys a company's reputation." Dylan finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "We didn't mean any harm." Elliot's gaze stayed locked on him. "But you caused it. That man you mocked? He could have been someone's grandfather. Someone who served his country. Someone who deserved basic decency. And instead, he got laughed at by employees who were supposed to be here to help." Travis swallowed hard, the weight of Elliot's words pressing down. Elliot exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. "Here's what's happening. You're both suspended effective immediately. If you want to keep your jobs, you'll be required to complete a full customer service retraining program. I'll be watching your records personally. One more complaint, one more incident, and you're gone." Dylan nodded quickly. Travis, though slower to react, eventually followed. Elliot didn't need to say anything else. He opened the door, signaling for them to leave. As they walked out, he could see that the arrogance they had displayed earlier was gone. With them dealt with, Elliot sat down at his desk for the first time that day. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but this was the first step in regaining control. The company he had built wouldn't be run by people who didn't respect it. And from now on, he would make sure of that personally. The next morning, Elliot arrived at the docks before sunrise, standing at the edge of the terminal as the first ferry of the day prepared for departure. The air was crisp, the sky still tinged with the last remnants of night. He had spent the evening reviewing employee reports, scrutinizing schedules, and making immediate structural changes. There was a lot to fix, but this time he wasn't going to rely on secondhand information. He was going to be present. A crew meeting had been called before the first shift, and the employees gathered inside the break room, murmuring amongst themselves. Some looked uneasy, having already heard about Greg's termination. Others were indifferent, not yet understanding the gravity of the situation. Elliot stood at the front of the room, waiting until the last worker filed in. When the room settled, he finally spoke. "What I saw yesterday was unacceptable." The weight of his words landed heavily, and the murmurs faded. Some employees shifted in their seats, while others kept their gazes fixed on the floor. This company was built on service, Elliot continued. Not just moving passengers from one dock to another, but making sure they feel safe, respected, and taken care of. What I experienced firsthand was a complete breakdown of that. I watched employees mock a passenger. I saw workers ignore customers. I heard maintenance staff joke about safety. And do you know what that tells me? That somewhere along the way, people stopped caring. A silence stretched across the room, thick with unspoken thoughts. Some employees glanced at each other, but no one dared to interrupt. Elliot's voice remained steady. That changes today. A man near the back, a senior deckhand, crossed his arms. With respect, Mr. Evans, things have been rough. We've been short-staffed for months, and when we bring up issues, nothing changes. It's hard to care when you feel like no one's listening. Elliot met the man's gaze. You're right, and that's on me. That answer seemed to surprise some of them. A few turned their heads, watching Elliot more intently now. I trusted the wrong people to oversee this company, Elliot admitted. I let management handle things without staying involved, and as a result, problems went unchecked. But that stops now. I'm not asking you to blindly trust me. I'm telling you that I'll be here, working alongside you, making sure these issues are actually fixed. The deckhand gave a small nod, seemingly satisfied with that answer. Others in the room looked more attentive now, realizing this wasn't just another empty speech. Elliot continued, addressing the entire group. Here's what's going to happen moving forward. Additional crew will be hired to ease the workload. Training protocols are being updated and customer service expectations are being reinforced. If you're here just to collect a paycheck while doing the bare minimum, this isn't the place for you. If you genuinely care about your work, you'll have my full support. A woman near the front, a dock supervisor, raised a hand slightly. What about leadership? If Greg was allowing things to slide, who's taking over his role? Elliot had already made that decision. He turned to the side and gestured toward a man standing near the doorway. This is Mark Reynolds. Effective immediately, he will be stepping in as interim district manager. Mark, a former operations manager from another region, stepped forward. He had a no-nonsense demeanor, his posture straight, his gaze sharp. I've worked in this industry for 20 years, Mark said. I don't tolerate laziness, and I don't ignore problems. If you have concerns, bring them to me. If you have complaints, I'll listen. But if you're here to cut corners and disrespect passengers, consider this your warning. There was a shift in the energy of the room. Some employees looked relieved, while others seemed to recognize that the days of coasting through shifts were over. Elliot stepped forward again. We're not going to fix everything overnight, but I promise you, this company is going to be something we can all be proud of again. Now, let's get to work. The meeting ended, and employees dispersed to their respective stations. Elliot didn't retreat to an office. Instead, he spent the day walking the docks, speaking to workers, listening to their concerns, and making sure his presence wasn't just symbolic. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, he knew this was only the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he felt certain that the company was back in the right hands. His own.